Hello, this is me, Dr. Tanya Hashik. Today's topic of discussion is various movements of joints. We have already discussed about various classification of joints based on structure, function, etc. Now we will discuss about the movements of these joints, and today's topic of discussion is flexion and extension. So body movements can be best explained when a person is standing in the anatomical position. So what is anatomical position? We have already discussed that when the body is in upright position with upper limb to the side of the body and palms facing forward, that is the anatomical position, and body movements can be best explained when a person is standing in this position. So we have already learned that synovial joint is a joint that gives maximum movement to the body. That is, it has got a wide range of movements. So now we will discuss about flexion and extension. So these are movements that takes place within the sagittal plane of the body. So sagittal plane, what is it? It is the plane that divides body into right and left half. So it passes through the body in a way that it divides body into right and left half. In the figure you can see what a sagittal plane is. So flexion and extension involves anterior and posterior movements. That is, it involves movements through this plane. Flexion and extension in vertebra. That is, flexion that takes place in body as well as in neck. We will discuss about these two topics. So flexion of neck is, it is a forward bending of neck, and flexion of body is the forward bending of the body, and extension means it is a straightening from the flex position or bending backwards. So in the figure you can see the flexion and extension of neck as well as flexion and extension of body. That is, flexion of neck means it is a forward bending of the neck, and extension means straightening from flex position or bending backwards, and it is the same for the body also. So what is lateral flexion? Lateral flexion means bending neck or bending body towards right or left side of the body. So lateral flexion means bending neck or body towards the right or left side. So in elbow flexion can be better explained as decreasing the angle between the bones, and it is also called the bending of joints, and extension as increasing the angle between the bones or straightening the joints. So flexion means decreasing the angle between bones or bending of joints, and extension means increasing the angle between the bones or straightening the joints. So in the figure you can see the elbow flexion as well as extension. So now we will discuss about flexion and extension of arm. So in the figure you can see that flexion of arm means it is the anterior going motion of arm, and extension is the posterior going motion of the arm. So with the help of figure you can easily understand what flexion and extension of arm is. That is, flexion and extension are movements that takes place within the sagittal plane. So flexion means the anterior going movement of the arm, and extension is the posterior going motion of the arm. Flexion and extension at wrist joint. In flexion, bending of hand at your wrist so that your palm faces your arm is called as flexion, and moving away of your hand so that palm faces upward is called as extension. So extension and flexion of wrist joint is bending downward at your wrist so that your palm faces your arm is flexion, and bending or moving away so that your palm faces upward is called as extension. So in this figure, the first one is the extension and the third one is the flexion of the wrist joint. So flexion and extension of thumb. In this figure you can see that in the same hand you can see the both flexion and extension, that is moving of thumb towards the palm is called as flexion and moving of thumb away from the palm is called as extension. In the figure, you can see both flexion and extension in the same picture. Flexion and extension of hip, that is moving thigh forward and upward is called as flexion of the hip, and posterior going motion of thigh is called as extension of hip. So in the figure you can see that, in the second figure you can see that bringing thigh forward and upward is called as the flexion of hip and posterior going motion of thigh is called as extension of hip. Flexion and extension of knee. In flexion of knee, it is the bending of knee to bring the foot posterior to thigh. That is, bending knee in such a manner that foot comes posterior to the thigh is called as knee flexion. And extension is the straightening of the knee. That is, straightening of the knee is called as extension. So, in the figure you can see knee flexion, that is bending of knee so that the foot comes posterior to the thigh. So, don't get confused with flexion of hip and flexion of knee. That is, in flexion of hip, it brings thigh forward and upward, whereas in knee flexion, it is a bending of knee to bring the foot posterior to the thigh. And extension is the straightening of knee. So, next is the hyperextension and hyperflexion. In hyperextension, it is the abnormal or excessive extension at a joint beyond normal range. That is, if a joint is extended beyond the normal range is called as hyperextension, and hyperflexion is the abnormal or excessive flexion at any joint is called as hyperflexion. So, hyperextension is the abnormal or excessive extension, that is, extension of any joint beyond normal is called as hyperextension.